So we're going to get started today. I am your moderator and your speaker, or one of your two speakers. I'm Max Zile, and I study sociology and have been active in the Palestine movement and also in the environmental movement. Probably most of you know Callie, who founded Cooperation Jackson, has been very active speaking out about issues involving ecology, the Green New Deal, and a just transition. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the general context, about why we are discussing the Green New Deal in the first place, some of the forces at play, and how we might approach it as independent leftists. And then Callie is going to offer a different interpretation of some similar topics and some of the different topics. So first is context. Why are we discussing the Green New Deal? This is not, I think, solely due to Ocasio-Cortez raising the issue. If you look at the climate reports, they have been raising the alarm not only about the severity of the climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis within which it is embedded, but also they have been raising the issue that you actually need a structural transformation of the economic system, which doesn't mean a structural transformation towards a more egalitarian or non-hierarchical social system, or what people in the past and present understand as communism or socialism. It just means that people understand that a system based on limitless extraction is physically destroying the environment, and that actually imperils everybody, including the very wealthy. So there's a much broader context within which a conversation about the Green New Deal is able to appeal to a wide segment of the US and indeed the world population. Right? I mean, it's worth keeping in mind that the first discussion of the Green New Deal came from Thomas Friedman, who has a very different vision of society than probably most of the people in this room, right? He actually doesn't think people in the Middle East should have societies. They should be kind of like destroyed wastelands. So we need to keep in mind that this is an idea that does not contain a specific politics. It's in fact an idea that represents a battleground, as does the entire environmental crisis writ large. So this has to be the starting point for understanding why we're discussing it and why there's so many distinct forces at play who are trying to put their brand on the Green New Deal and structure the Green New Deal in the way that they think will best represent their interests and constitute a new society. This brings us to the question of the Green New Deal as a battlefield. Is the Green New Deal, is it policy or is it politics? So, of course, the Ocasio-Cortez plan suddenly put in place a lot of ideas for clean transition, upgrading of renewables, and a new industrial strategy. Talked somewhat less or not at all about the Global South, did talk about frontline communities, but in what I would argue are very deliberately vague ways. Nevertheless, this did do a good service in suddenly propelling the issue of climate change into the mainstream of both elite discussion and also popular discussion. So there is a mounting urgency about the issue of climate change, which everyone, of course, I think both appreciates, and those who don't appreciate need to appreciate, because climate change is pretty much a fait accompli. Like, it's already destroying everything. You know, you can read in the paper today that Chennai is actually out of water because of a historic drought. 4 years ago, it was actually suffering historic floods. And this is because everything is out of kilter, because the monsoons came too intensely and there wasn't an ability to absorb the water, and now the monsoons are too late. And so the historic patterns that allow some form of civilization in places like the Global South are actually collapsing right now. Not yesterday, and they aren't collapsing in 10 years with this 10-year horizon that's put in place for talking about climate change. No. Already the disaster is hitting the Global South today. Now, there's a lot of forces that are putting a lot of proposals into place. So you can see a wide range of things, ranging from kind of the most right wing to the most left wing. So you see, for example, there's think tanks in Australia called the Breakthrough Institute. Any institute called Breakthrough should set off an alarm bell, because they're all funded by the same people, and what they want to do is break the system and put in place a new one. They are saying that there needs to be arrangement between the national security state, businesses, and what they call communities, in order to put in place a system, a more sustainable system of economic production and consumption, right? So they are well aware of it, because Australia is very close to Southeast and South Asia, and they're going to have to deal with floods of immigration that they are incapable structurally of dealing with. So they're like, okay, we need to stabilize the system in order so that our system of accumulation here in Australia can continue. And they're willing to use the national security state to do so, right? So this is basically an argument for a form of fascism. you have more kind of conventional, seem conventional arguments from people like Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren is like, okay, we can use the opportunity of the Green New Deal to set in place a new system of clean tech export. So basically, what she wants to do is relaunch a new industrial revolution based on clean tech and based on the advantages the US would supposedly have to export clean tech technology to Europe and also especially the global south. So this is basically continuing capitalist imperialist industrial supremacy based on a new form of technology that hopefully won't destroy the climate as much as the current system is doing. That's another option, the Warren option. Then there are the options coming from Ocasio-Cortez. Now, what's worth keeping in mind is that actually, she put out the initial resolutions in February, and it's already basically July. There's still no details about that. And so we don't know about it, which doesn't actually, I don't think that means we should think of it as a blank slate upon which we can put whatever we want. There was a decision clearly to not put out more details yet. Why that decision was made, we really don't know yet, but this isn't happening by clumsiness. We can also consider that the new consensus, which is actually the think tank that designed the idea of the Green New Deal, what they said is that they want to put in place a governing domestic agenda and to see the elephant whole. So basically, it's somewhat similar to what Elizabeth Warren said. They want to reconstruct the US economic system and put in place basically what I think would argue is a new system of hierarchy. Okay, so this brings us to the third question, which is, I think, a very important question for us in this room, which is how we think of the Green New Deal and how we can think of it on independent terms. So is the Green New Deal something that politicians and whatever academics they want to purchase come up with, craft, and then we want to lobby them to make it a little better, to include a few more frontline communities in the United States, to maybe not hit India and North Africa quite as hard, so that some of the clean tech becomes grants instead of sales? Is that the kind of system we wish to aspire to? Is it a system in which we want to basically lobby the existing forces to put in place a somewhat better Green New Deal than they would put in of their own accord? That is one option, right? And that is the option that is kind of the historic approach of lobbying the Democratic Party for some kind of measure of inclusion within their policy agenda. Another idea, of course, which I think is the idea I advocate, is to actually say, okay, the Green New Deal is enormously popular. 70% of the US population wants a Green New Deal, and that is something we should definitely get behind. Not only because the climate crisis is already destroying the planet, but actually because there's a much wider ecological crisis, right? Biodiversity is actually collapsing, and we don't really know what's going to happen when this web of life collapses. Like when the entire biospheric interactions, when there's no more insects, we don't know how we're going to continue life on this planet actually, right? The issue is that severe. The topsoil loss is like 40% or 30% planet-wide over the last 50 years. I mean, there's a widespread ecological crisis. So what I think is better is to think, okay, the idea of the Green New Deal is very popular, but what we need is to put our forces into play, to figure out what those forces are, of course, and put them into play and say we reject the technocratic top-down models of a Green New Deal, and what we want to put in place again is a People's New Deal. And this is exactly what the Red Nation recently did. They said, okay, we want a Red Deal, and they put in place a certain set of policies that are much more radical than anything you hear coming out of, the New Republic or Ocasio-Cortez or New Consensus or Elizabeth Warren or that's on the stage of the Democratic debates, right? And this is a very different policy orientation. It's not a policy orientation at all. It's a people's orientation based on building autonomous power and then using that, of course, inevitably it's going to influence what politicians say and do, but it doesn't take what politicians say and do and their policy proposals as something that we need to reshape or remold and tinker with. Instead, it says, okay, what are our values? What kind of world do we want? Do we want a world in which most of the world has the right to food, water, air, which are the historic goals of some people who, or you could say development? Does most of the world deserve control over their own food systems? Do they deserve sustainable agricultural systems? Do they deserve to have systems in which their agriculture is devoted to feeding the domestic population? Do they deserve their own industrial systems that are sustainable and that don't rely on exploitation and imperialism? And what is our interaction with that? What do we want? We want clean cities, and yesterday, the ozone in New York there was an air quality issue. I looked on my phone and it said that the air quality index was a 159. I didn't know what that meant. I mean, maybe I haven't been here in a little while, but yeah, it was very bad. I was like I took a walk. I could barely breathe afterwards. It's absurd, right? I mean, it's actually not a way to structure and this is the richest city in the richest country in the world. And we don't even have clean air on a summer afternoon, right? So it's also about what we want. It's not a question of saying, okay, how can we accommodate everyone else? It's like, how can everyone accommodate one another such that everyone has the right to all of these basic things, including functioning mass transit, good jobs for everybody, guaranteed health care, guaranteed clean food that doesn't filled with plastics and chemicals and whatever else they put in place in our sandwiches. So the question is, how can we begin to orient to the Green New Deal in such a way that those interests are the ones that formulate the program, and then that program is what we use to fight for a different kind of future. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kelly.
I want to come back to this one piece about policy or politics. Through my work in Cooperation Jackson, we are in a lot of these conversations about, with Ocasio and her crew in different ways, and folks trying to shape a number of different things. And I can just tell you, on the serious side, we're struggling with them to take the issue serious. And for us, that means this can't just be a hook for election mobilization for 2020, which is fundamentally how it's being used and mobilized, by her little section and wing, however it's emerging of the Democratic Party, just speaking frankly. And trying to put up a position with some of the forces that we align with, saying it's not just it's a matter of consulting with frontline communities or being in some dialogue with folks. Like there's a much deeper process that has to be both fought through and thought through in the course of the next 3 to 4 years, quite honestly, around how do we actually build and extend the concrete work around people building an alternative on the ground. And then, I hate to use this word, but that there's a particular way of kind of scaling up and federating out so that the work reinforces itself, and then there's a level of both kind of movement building, but also protection of the work so that it extends and grows out. Because there's a lot of fundamental, as Max was saying, there's a lot of fundamental projects, here in the United States and well beyond, of folks who are, without waiting for some command or some forces on high, who are actually trying to experiment and build in real time things that are regenerative in nature. But they're not projected, they're really not connected to a great extent, and then fundamentally, politically and ideologically, not necessarily aligned. So there's kind of a broad recognition that we have to do something different, but it's not a clear sense of where the difference is. Like, where are we going with this? Where do we need to go? And we need to have a much deeper conversation about that. And I would interject, we need to start having a clear articulation around this whole framework around eco-socialism, right? With a stated aim and objective. And I think many people are kind of, in the mass conversation, trying to skirt that and just say we can do something different without shifting power, without shifting society and reorganizing society. That's not going to work, right? Fundamentally, I would argue with folks, that's not going to work. Like, we have to be clear about where we're trying to go and then put it in a deeper context. I think, personally, we do ourselves sometimes the injustice of just talking about it as, climate change. We're in the midst of the 6th grade extinction event right now. Right? And they are related, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And the piece around the 6th extinction event, there's no fundamental argument that the way we've gone about, and I'm speaking we in a broad generic sense, the way capitalism has moved on the planet the last 200 years, human-directed action, has basically reduced life on this planet in the last 50 years in particular, has been extremely severe. And then now this wallop of, the Earth systems functioning in ways that nature can't keep up. Like, that's a whole different thing. And to me, where it became apparent, to give you just an anecdote, like in Mississippi, some of the things that we've seen, I've seen just in my own little garden and stuff, in my own, yard, was a couple of years ago, I think it was like 2016, the roses bloomed in January, right? They bloomed in January, and it's not typically supposed to happen until like March. And what that meant was the cycle of, the insects which survive off of the set of plants that we have, they didn't gestate early enough. And so then the birds came a couple of, like in April, where their eggs laid, and half of the babies just in my yard, they starved to death, they died. Because the cycle was just off. One thing depended upon another thing, connected to another thing. And just that early bloom just threw everything off just in the scope of my own yard. And that is very much directed to how we've built our cities, how we've done this massive suburbanization over the last 70, 80 years, totally reduced, all the various ecosystems in a constant pursuit of expansion, particularly the American version of how you build things out. For me, I think some of the things I've been talking about or trying to interject in the conversation of late, thinking that we're just going to have a better version of this, like a cleaner version of this, is not going to work. Like, there's going to have to be a reorganization on a massive scale that I don't even think we fully realize. Like, what would a new urban environment look like that was regenerative? What would transportation look like on a national scale that was regenerative? The reduction in cars and transportation. How are we going to argue, particularly in this culture, with saying, look, we all need to get out of our cars, more bikes, more public transportation? Most folks are going to read that as a restriction on their freedom, right? Not an expansion of it, but a restriction of it. So there's a deeper way in which I think we have to create and have a real political discussion and injection of real politics, not just this policy pursuit of, let's get more folks to turn out for the elections to put a Democrat in office who then might put some policy proposals or some policy things in place that would tweak on the edges. Like, that's not going to cut it. So I'll end there. I think we want to just get into more like dialogue back and forth with folks, because I think Max set like a good framework out for us, and just really kind of respond if you find with that. Open it up.
Yeah, definitely.
I would like you to expand a little bit more on AOC and what you're talking about. I know she's sort of on the left of it, but what's your take on what she's putting out?
What do you mean, like her policy things?
Yeah, the Green New Deal as she's pushing it.
You want to touch on that, or?
I mean, I'll touch on some of it, but you can probably speak better about how that's been playing out in dynamics on the ground. But I mean, in the general sense, the proposal she put in place was very vague, but there were some specifics that we can point to that should be troubling, right? She's talking about community, state, business partnerships. She is. I mean, and it's not being discussed very much, which speaks to the role of the left media in whether or not it's educating or diseducating us, right? But a state business partnership is not a left project for me. That is a different kind of project. And what a state business partnership means probably is the state pays the cost and the business gets the profits and the people get the scraps, right? And then she can talk about frontline communities, but if the actual skeletal or structural mechanism through which she wants to put in place includes the idea of state business partnerships, that's not a left project. That's a project for governing capitalism. So for me, that's a red flag. And for me, that's not what socialism is. And I mean, for me, that makes it, I think there's a problem to think about what Ocasio-Cortez is doing as socialism when she's talking about state business partnerships. But I think Kelly's much better informed on how that's playing out.
Even that, like, so you brought up one point that's also embedded in there earlier. There's a very explicit platform around exporting green tech that was very explicit in a major component of the program that she put out. So you marry these two pieces together, you get a clear sense of, this is just a re-articulation of the military-industrial complex just with a green focus, just to put it in some historical context. That's what's being kind of proposed.
So she would not agree with eco-socialism as the way you've articulated it?
I don't think even we've articulated it fully. I think we've said, like, these are the things it must include, but a deeper conversation of what are the actual social relationships that are necessary to make that happen. That's a deeper conversation that I think we have some outlines of, but I don't think we have a developed enough practice to say this is what it would need to be like, right? So I think even that's a gap on our side that we have to put up. Now in dialogue, she and some of the forces around her haven't necessarily been opposed, but they've tried to take a more, I would say, concession to a realistic option of, what forces of capital do we need to kind of rally to be on our side to form the strongest political bloc that could get legislation passed. Like that is morally approached. So there's been a vagueness of stepping back once there was some, kind of criticism and some challenge, and they've been basically was a Sunrise and New Consensus, and some of the folks have basically been on kind of like a listening tour that they've been orchestrating and planning out the last couple of months. It's still going on right now. I'm going up to Detroit in I think about 2 weeks' time where there's supposed to be some piece around this that's going on. And then you got groups like the Climate Mobilization that have been trying to work with Bernie here. And I think on Tuesday, they're launching kind of their campaign of calling for a national emergency to be declared around climate, which is also a part of this. And so some of the dialogue I think that people have with Bernie, one of the things that he made clear, which is why I don't think it's necessarily going to go too far, is that he wouldn't sign on anything, if my understanding is correct. He wouldn't sign on to anything unless the AFL-CIO was going to sign off on it, right? And most of the AFL-CIO, particularly the sectors concentrated in and around energy, are very much opposed to the Green New Deal, in fact. So you get a real sense of the mix of forces that she and then, by a broader extension, we have to deal with on this piece where just the basic old school elements of a just transition framework of saying we need to stop the petrochemical industry, protect those workers by retraining them and moving them. Like they're not even on that basic level of the platform. We're just saying we should extend this and it should keep growing. There should be more fracking, And if you look at just the contradictions of how the AFL-CIO responded to what was going on up in the Dakotas, with the pipeline. Yeah, Keystone Pipeline. I mean, took a terrible position on that, fundamentally. So there's a posture that folks are trying to move them in a particular direction and get them on board as a case study, get them on board as a player in the game of how the Green New Deal should be articulated, far and above looking at, groups on the ground in Jackson or New Orleans or here, because they see the AFL-CIO as an institutional player with both resource and a political reach in a way that they don't see us. So the concession is going to be towards that, not towards what the science actually dictates and reality dictates that we need, right? That's not where she and they are at right now.
So I want to sort of connect this question about the state and businesses, and I'm actually kind of also responding to the AOC thing, and I agree that it's vague and that it's deliberately vague, and now that she's in Washington, there's reasons for that, right? So at the same time, I think my question is if we're going to talk about an eco-socialist Green New Deal, and full disclosure, I'm going to be on the panel that the Green Party, the New York Green Party is organizing, Budget for an Eco-Socialist Green New Deal. The view here is that there is some role for in the intermediate term between here and eco-socialism in the future, right? So if we're going to survive this juncture, I mean, you just said 3 years, which I agree. I mean, the window for action here is very urgent, right? So if we're going to survive this crisis that we're in right now, I don't see how that can happen without some role for the state. And I also don't see how that can happen without markets, because we have a market economy. Right now, my version of socialism is worker-owned and controlled enterprises. That's how I would define socialism. If you're not going to produce, if you think you're going to abolish the state and you're going to abolish the markets, then my question is, well, how do you organize production? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but in a 3-year time frame, we're not going to abolish the state, we're not going to abolish markets. So the question is, what can be crafted in this historical context that could meet this crisis? And I'm wrapping up now. And I think that what's going to be proposed in this other panel is $2 trillion a year of massive green public investment, massive demilitarization of like 3/4 of the war machine, plowing that into green investment, and that should be a kind of vision of what needs to happen. And you know, if that gets co-opted by Elizabeth Warren in a watered-down form, I'll be happy.
So I agree that, of course, there'll be a role, realistically, for states and markets in the coming 3, 4, 5 years in terms of stopping the most severe impacts of what will happen otherwise. That's clear. And it's 99% certain that's also going to occur through some form of politician, whether that be Elizabeth Warren or Ocasio-Cortez, who has a different vision of the world than most of the people in this room. That I agree with as well. What I think is very important, and of course I think the Green Party has really done a great job in putting forward progressive policy proposals concerning the ecological crisis, is to make sure that we understand that these forces are essentially not very sympathetic to the vision of the world that people have generally in this room. So to have a clear-eyed assessment of what those forces represent as we enter the battlefield of trying to push for the kind of world we wish to see. And so I think that there's a push to not clarify what those forces are in order to gather all the necessary support essentially to defeat Trump, right? So there's a push to water down or soften a critique of the funding behind most of these people, the vision of the world they have, the alliances they seek, to say, okay, well, it's not a very big deal that Ocasio-Cortez doesn't want to attack the petroleum companies, or it's not a big deal that she hasn't called for demilitarization when the military is like the second largest producer of greenhouse gas, never mind what the effects of all the mining it does on the overall ecology, right? There's a push to de-emphasize those critiques, and the people pushing that are part of the kind of like para-agenda or the para-apparatus of the Democratic Party, and we need to be able to identify that if we want to gather an autonomous group or movement or force of any kind to push for an agenda which will then, yes, be adopted in a modified and watered down form, but that's life. But we have to be able to move accurately on the battlefield.
So, just in brief, I disagree with part of that, the last part of what you said, whether Elizabeth Warren, if she does some watered down version of it, then that's cool. I think that, there's a real politic that I hear you expressing. But look, I think if we don't swing for the fences on this, we're gonna miss the boat. Because there's a way in which we know the intersections of this have the necessarily transformative potential, even in the public's imagination, that's been missing for quite some time. And if we concede that we need to let various sectors of capital actually remain in place and kind of dictate the outcome of it, then we're going to lose out in the end.
Just to clarify, I think that we need to have an independent political force pushing for exactly what you're talking about. But just as in the 1930s, it was the socialist and communist parties that pushed the Democrats to adopt the original Green New Deal. In the near term, that's the model.
And I reject that model.
Okay.
That's my point. I reject that. I mean, I think we can look at that as a particular point in what FDR and those forces did was save capitalism. Is that what we want to repeat?
No, we just want to save the planet. That's what we're trying. That's what we're talking about now.
Right, but in order to do that, we're gonna have to get rid of the all the major corporations. A green Boeing is still Boeing running the show.
Right. I mean, one of the things that we're proposing in the eco-socialist budget is to buy out 51% of the fossil fuel companies, to be able to defang them, to prevent them from being able to, stop.
I'm pushing us to so I heard that and I read some of that, right? We need to push deeper
Okay.
on that, because I think there's a limitation in our own imaginations that we keep conceding power to the corporations as the being the only vehicle who can execute anything on a mass scale. And it's still removing us from the equation of how do we actually empower people and build the necessary force on the productive level, not just on the level of we have some coalition politics which elects this or elect that. We got to think deeper than that.
Okay.
Right? That's what I'm pushing for.
Two questions, they're connected. So first, how do you envision bringing in the communities in Global South to wherever we are shaping here? And second, you mentioned scaling up and federating out. I wonder how that would connect to building international networks.
There's kind of two separate ways to address the question of inclusion of communities in the Global South in terms of how we think about an actual People's Green New Deal. I mean, first of all, there's the question of actual political instruments. Like, we need an international, and it's not news that the US left is not in a condition to enter into an international. But nevertheless, that should be the aspiration, right? Which also means to have, there's kind of a revival of Kautskyism at the moment, and so this is kind of pushing against an internationalist politics. We need to be very clear that when we think about politics here, in all ways, shape, and forms, it should be oriented both towards a horizon that includes everybody, or all the working peoples of the world, and that actually actively seeks to think about what concrete steps can be taken to build out from where we are to building those links. So, I mean, to be a little more concrete, you now see people actually discussing biofuels, right? And this is part of the displacement of the discussion from politics in terms of the constitution of building a collective political subject that's internationalist, or policy. And people are like, well, biofuels, that could be a good idea. But actually policy is, in that sense, already deciding what the politics are. Because if you're saying, okay, well, maybe the biofuels are an okay idea, you're actually saying we don't want to work with Via Campesina. You're saying we don't want to work with the most significant peasant movements organized on every single continent of the world, and that have the most organized working people in the countryside and the small peasants of the entire planet, because they have a very clear position against biofuels, right? So, what that can mean concretely is, of course, bringing people, if there are forums about the Green New Deal in communities, to say, okay, why don't we have someone from Via Campesina? They're not talking about a Green New Deal, but they've been talking about using smallholder agroecology to cool the planet for at least 10 years. Right? So why aren't they at the table when there's a discussion about the Green New Deal? Okay, then there may very well have already been a decision to exclude them from the political horizon, right? So I think that plays out locally or organizationally in a lot of different ways, but in the broadest sense, it's about making sure that any specific discussion isn't already excluding the Global South from its vision.
Yeah, I don't have, only thing I would really add to that is I find that those of us in the US, Canada, Europe, our organization is far behind where the organization is in the Global South, on the political level. So there's some organizing work that we have to do. And I think the challenge is how do we do that in a way which puts the international politics at the forefront and not become just another US-centered trip or European-centered focused trip. That's going to be a major challenge that we have to figure out in the here and now.
I agree with colleagues' riff on Rosa Luxemburg's socialism or barbarism. It's socialism or extinction now. And I think it's an accurate thing. But I don't think his points are that invalid either. And you sort of went to it when you talked about how, well, they think that, our freedom is going to be violated if we implement parts of the Green New Deal. I don't think the authors of the Green New Deal, as articulated by the wings of the progressive Democrats, so-called progressive Democrats, have thought that through very much, because the Trumponian advisors in the White House, in the West Wing of the White House, have picked up on some of the, not the Green New Deal itself, but what they went into was AOC's commentary on it, where they said, well, we're going to ban cows. Well, that's part of the talk around this question. I'm a big defender of cows myself. I love cows. And this idea that you're not going to eat a hamburger anymore and stuff is going to be used against and is being used now. And it goes to a bigger question about development and de-development. And you know, when you talk about the Breakthrough Institute, which I actually think is an American institution, not an Australian one.
There's,
you talk about,
there's two. That's
oh,
why it's funny.
I'm familiar. I actually know many of the people in the eco-modernist one, which is the one here in the United States, which is another question. But it does raise the issue of, you know, Colin, when you say it's not going to be a better now or a better this, I actually don't agree with you, because I think that if we don't have a better, if the reason the global south is outputting increasing amounts of CO2 is because they're trying to electrify their societies. Because right now, renewable energy in Ghana means cow dung burning down your forest to make charcoal. That's renewable energy there. In India, burning cow dung kills 30,000 people a year from asphyxiation. Almost all of them women and children. So forms of development need to be discussed. You know, I used to talk here on this in this forum years ago where I said, you know, it's not about having a big screen TV. It's not about a Sub-Zero fancy gourmet refrigerator. It's like a half-height refrigerator so your food doesn't spoil. It means the most ubiquitous thing in the world for us is that light switch that you don't even think about. Well, 1 billion people don't have a light switch. They want to have a light switch, and they're pushing their leaders to get those light switches. The leaders are installing huge amounts of coal energy, for instance, and CO2 producing forms of output. And that can't necessarily be replaced with renewable energy. And this is one of the things why we have to talk about, because in the global south, the things that many of those people don't like, who say aren't in via campesinos, though I agree with their perspective to a large degree, is stop telling us to be poor. And we have to have an answer for that internationally. Because if one acts like the World Wildlife Federation, which is Malthusian, quite honestly, and some of the larger established NGOs that legitimately try to defend wildlife and rural ways of life, it means it's adopting a Kipling, the noble, you know, poor person, which I think we have to be very clear on, that we're for an increase in standard of living in a way that's ecologically attainable. And that's what it can save the planet. You know, I'll end with this. Helen Caldicott, who I can't stand personally because I think she's factually so inaccurate on so many things, says there's something wrong. We don't want to recycle because recycling uses energy, and energy is the enemy. And that's a quote. And she says there's nothing wrong with reading by candlelight. We did it for 200 years. We have to reject that aspect of it and come up with real human alternatives. And I think we need to make that transition to what you're talking about, which is getting rid of imperialism, quite honestly, and commodity capitalism with some form of a program. I don't have it, but that addresses those issues.
My main thing is, and I like how you went there, is that we aren't utilizing our imagination enough in movement building. And we stick to my opposition is not so much that is a reality that we're gonna have to confront. But is it one that we should orient our politics to? See, I think the way Max framed it, like if you start off with like, you know, we're just gonna build more electrical, you know, access, you know, and that's a way we're gonna try to do it in some clean way throughout the world. All right, that limits my politics. I don't have to change many social relationships to do that, right? So that's the deeper piece I'm saying. We don't have to change much, because you can come up with a very paternalistic program wherein, let's say Bernie wins and he wants to electrify the world by getting all the U.S. companies to go figure out a way to do electricity cheap in Ghana. Someone like that, since you mentioned it, we can figure out some way and finance it through debt that'll keep Ghana, in the U.S. back pocket for the next 200 years, right? That's a program they could easily come up with very quickly in some benevolent way. So is that what we want to articulate, right? Wherein you have a situation in Greece. Greece basically now is going to be in the back pocket of Germany's to the 2050s by their own admission of the deal that they just signed, right? Like, is that what we want? Like, so if we don't use our imagination, we wind up engaging in what I call concessionary politics from the very beginning of our thinking. right? That I'm going to concede that I can't win, so let me get the best deal I can get out of the situation and then put off the real transformation further on down the line. But there's some deeper questions I think we do have to look at. So yeah, I don't think it should be, for me, I'm not trying to subscribe anybody to a candlelight future. But I do think that there's a piece that we have to recognize is that if we keep doing what we're doing now, we're going to be living in a world of plastic that's associated with having that small refrigerator. Still, that's not sustainable. So something different is going to have to be worked out in a way that it can't be more concrete and steel as the means of improving the overall quality of life. There has to be a different way of integrating ourselves back into the natural environment that I don't think we're thinking about enough. Except that, like, sometimes people want to joke like you want to be a hippie. I'm like, no, I ain't talking about that either. But I think there are some ways in which we have to look at the very nature of what we've produced in the last couple of years is toxic in the long term. Utilizing chemicals and chemistry in the way that we use it to build this civilization is fundamentally toxic to the earth and breaks down natural systems. So we have to do a deeper level of reintegration is what I mean, and not just think we're going to have a bunch of this. Now, that doesn't mean to me, in my imagination, that the quality of life goes down by means of health indicators or access to certain material services and goods. Like, I think that could actually increase, right? But it requires a different orientation to, is the quality of life being able to access cable TV, or is quality of life being able to access all of you in organic social relationships? Which one is it? That's what I'm articulating. Which one is it? Because the easiest route is reproduce, what people have in mind and as an aspiration is, I want to get to where America is. And I was, challenging certain comrades internationally, like, I don't know if you want that. Because the way some of this has been built actually individualizes society, but we don't even get together, we don't socialize together, we don't mingle together. That's not the articulation of being a human that I think we all eventually want to aspire to.
I think it's also important that we keep in mind, first, of course, I fundamentally agree that like a project, we have to control industrialization. We have to not eliminate it, but it has to be controlled and it has to be structured in such a way that there's convergence. So everyone on the planet fundamentally deserves the same level of industrialization. And we have to decide what kind of things we do and don't need in terms of industry. Medical care, actually a lot of medical care is superfluous and a lot of it is bad, but there are certain things that we don't know how to make in non-industrial ways. And okay, we agree that medical care is fundamental. This chair is made of metal, even though you can make chairs of wood in a sustainable way that's carbon absorbing. This is just something very straightforward, right? That is structured in such a way that we've been presented, say, that this is what modernity looks like and this is what development looks like. Power, everyone deserves power, but I don't think we should say that the forms of development that have occurred so far in the global south and that actually generally elites have structured as the horizon that people should aspire to, that those are actually what development is. I work actually directly on the project of development and food sovereignty in Tunisia, right? And a fundamental problem, a fundamental obstacle, including in Tunisia, is convincing people, including people in the cities, that there is no developmental path that doesn't rely on restorative agriculture. It can't happen. And in fact, they're running out of water. The whole country is dying, right? Because of the path of development that was put in place since the 1950s and the 1960s, primarily by the United States. And so they put in tens of millions of dollars in putting in these huge hydroelectric dams that supposedly give them electricity, even though there still isn't enough electricity, that supposedly give them irrigation water, even though there's ways of producing irrigation in the countryside that don't rely on using any power and that rely on entirely renewable materials. So we need to, I think this goes back to what Kelly is saying, that there needs to be a discussion about what are the ecological effects of given technologies and how can that be thought of on a global basis without thinking, okay, we need to give people candles. No, we need to decide where and when we can use industry and when we're willing to let it go, because now our bodies are probably 10% plastic. Like, that's not okay, but that was never presented to us as a choice. That was kind of presented to us as, okay, this is modernity, take it or leave it, and take it. I think there's a very big discussion about what development looks like. And I think that's actually been one of the really good things about some of the discussion that the Green New Deal has provoked, alongside a lot of like the unrealistic discussion that's focused on mustering votes for the Democratic candidate, I think there's a good discussion about what are forms of technology, including here in the US, that are appropriate for people. And I think also, and all of that contains a politics, including banning cows and hamburgers, which is also bad. I mean, we want restorative ranching on board to restore the soil with the Green New Deal. And so when people in these think tanks are talking about artificial meat, they're actually alienating these people who could be brought on board with a Green New Deal coalition, a People's Green New Deal coalition, based on actually restoring the grasslands of the entire western half of the country using restorative agriculture. That's not even part of the discussion because there's a technocratic discussion top down about policy that is reflecting the interest of a very narrow set of people, articulating a very narrow worldview. And I think that also is similar in the global south, unfortunately, at the current moment, and that's because certain voices aren't at the table, including Via Campesina.
So I've spent most of my life building the traditional labor movement. I'm from Vermont too, so I do know Bernie Sanders. But building the traditional labor movement and being a quiet socialist. And I find these times both terrifying and exciting. Right, 70% of people want a Green New Deal. That's news to me. I'm very surprised by it. The majority of young people aren't opposed to socialism, maybe socialism. Like, we have a tremendous opportunity here. Setting aside electoral politics, are there intermediate steps or projects that you all think are exciting that are going on, ways that to engage folks who don't necessarily call themselves socialists, right, to build towards that? So what's the intermediate step? And what do you all, just a couple examples, moving mass organizations towards this kind of politics?
The list of things that I would point you to is pretty big. I mean, stuff here in New York, some of the stuff we're talking about, what many people, in some of the circles I run are calling, Afroecology, projects in Cleveland, projects in Detroit, some of the work that we are now, kind of deeply involved in, are all things I think that speak to people being political subjects and acting in the real world of saying, hey, we got to start here. Now, I think I'm not one who agrees with this line that, farming is the most revolutionary thing that you can do. But that line is out there. I can understand in part where it's germinated from. But so there's a ton of work that's going on. The level of experimentation in the here and now I don't think is our problem. I think our problem is how do we all connect and form the political strength that we need to exercise a greater social force, and engage in real politics in society. That piece is missing, but almost every city, there's 10 to 15 between the co-op work, the urban agriculture work, the housing struggle work that's going on here in New York. There's a ton of work that's going on here, but I'm often amazed when I come to New York, this group doesn't know about this other group, or they're not connected to each other's work in any, concrete way, and not thinking, I think, about, well, how do we start from here to envisioning a way in which we can build the political strength to have first an impact, but then maybe re-articulate what New York City is, right? So it's that space, it's that organizing that I think is missing. That is the intermediate step that I think that we need to take from the experimentation that's going on to building. What I meant by scaling up, I meant organizing. I don't mean some massive new factory or something like that. I mean organizing concrete people to say, okay, this is how we're going to connect. This is how we're going to resource each other's work so we break a certain dependency on finance in the form of philanthropy. How do we do all of that in a particular way? That's the big piece that I think is missing right now. I think there's, of course, education. But with it, I think there has to be some organization. And I think some of the motion that you're discussing is at least in this country, is going to run into some hard lessons and contradictions real quick. And so what do I mean by that? So I live in Mississippi, which is controlled by the Tea Party. I wouldn't even, just call it the Republican Party. It's the Tea Party in the Republican dress that runs the state that I live in. And now, why do I bring this up? Because by next April, when our next legislative session ends, they are going to basically cut off and make mass protests illegal. And it won't be the last state to do that. Like, that's policies that have been progressively sneaking through states and cities all across the country since, Black Lives Matter kind of picked up off the Picatero piece of blocking the highways, and then what happened to Keystone. Like, this has been creeping up, and then Trump just recently said that he wanted to put some national legislation that would ban or put some major serious prison time on folks who protest, pipeline extraction and development. Now, in most, at least on the state level, there's about 30 states which have the supermajorities set in place to make this law. That's something we need to realize. And so the struggle is going to take some immediate shifts. And what I was saying about the 3 years, like, the right is already advancing to a place that for us to take definitive action to save ourselves is going to be taking place in the context of our actions are going to be technically illegal. And are we as a movement, are we prepared for that? See, that's what I'm saying. So a little bit more than education. Like, you got to educate people to the fact that this is how the right is moving to take preventative measures so that they kind of remain in power, and there's no legal, democratic, liberal way of affecting change. But our survival is going to basically mitigate it at some point, we're going to have to go beyond that, right? We're going to have to go beyond the mere protest, because that will, just being out in the street against a pipeline might land you 10 years in jail already in some states, right? So there's a level of the here and now and the immediacy of, we better open up our imaginations to think about social relationships and power very quickly, because they are constricting the playground as it exists, the battlefield as it exists. And if we're going to move, we better be prepared, at least in this country. And I think this is going on I know in Europe, different countries in Europe, they're doing the same thing. Macron is putting forth laws, mirrored on the laws here, and I think in Hungary, that are specifically targeting yellow vest movements to say that this type of protest is illegal. So we need to put that. I'm registering as the element of real politics. We are going to have to deal with that, and to recognize, this is why I was pushing back, having to recognize that they could make certain concessions, right, towards, hey, if y'all go and we can work with the corporations and we can work with the politicians to set certain targets, to change a few things and tweak, but nothing else remains the same. You can have a version of what gets passed which could literally coexist with the repressive apparatus that they put in place. I mean, I think we really need to think about that and grapple with it. Those two things, the way it's what's being proposed now, and you can't protest against a pipeline, or you can't protest to have more recycling or renewable energy in your town, those two things could coexist.
That's a form of fascism, too.
It's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
There was a question over here.
Thank you guys, first off, for coming in here. I always feel revitalized when I get in the midst of these types of conversations, but ultimately all of us believe here will return to our communities, mine blue collar mixed with a rather wealthy liberal elite, and I'm finding it very difficult to find ways to connect these people to have any kind of mobility. We have a local Green Party, consistently gets about 1 or 2% of the vote. Do you see any existing vehicles for this type of these people to think about different things? I know you mentioned imagination. If you go into the schools, it's about compliance, obedience. I don't find a lot in the form of imagination that would force kids to be somewhat think with dissent, because we're going to leave here, and again, it's the same thing every year, and I'll go with my third-party friends and whatnot, but I'm not seeing the traction. We'll elect our Democratic congressman who will drag his feet, and I'll come back next year, and I hope things have improved. What do you suggest? What vehicles are working to make these changes come? Because someone over here mentioned something about the slow change versus some quicker change. I can't even get slow change.
I think in some respects, mass consciousness far exceeds the level of of having vehicles to execute where that consciousness is. Right. So, like you cited about 70% of the people polled at least.
Yeah, or the Democratic voters or the people.
Right.
I don't remember which.
Believe in like a Green New Deal, or they would be supportive of it. That far exceeds the actual organization to put it in place, right?
But will they endorse a Green New Deal that doesn't have a capitalist logic to it? That would be-
I think most would if the option was actually presented. Yeah, I think most would. And I think if people kind of understood, that gets back in part to some of the education work, I think it would. Look, I mean, in short, this is what I see in my work and what I argue for. Half the people who live in this country who are voting age and have voting access, which everybody don't, people choose not to engage. I don't think there's pure apathy. I think most people are like, why am I going to vote for the same old shit over and over and over again? Whoever I vote, they're going to do pretty much kind of the same damn thing. And most people, I think, are keenly aware of that at this point. If we can construct a real option, right, a real viable option, I think people will move. So again, to me, I just put out that the tried and true things around organizing, meeting people, figuring out what they want, what they desire, what skills they have, what level of coming together that they're willing to execute together, and then act upon that. Like that tried and true, that hasn't changed and won't change, I don't think, in the future. And we're going to have to, I think, really get down and dirty on that. But I think the piece is what's the vision and what's the program. And if it keeps being a mirror and conceding to certain compromises, most folks are not going to go with that. Right? This is like we know where that's ultimately going to lead. And it really don't have much room or space for me in it. And I think, look, there's some qualitative shifts that are happening. I mean, let's be real. I mean, I hear part of what you're saying, but like in 2004, if you would have asked me in 2004, would something like Occupy exist, I would have laughed at you. And how quickly that changed public conversation and public consciousness to a certain extent, to where now we're still not having a direct conversation about class, but at least there's a conversation about inequality that didn't exist in the 90s that we weren't having. Then there's been social action and movement on the backs of that. So things are changing. I think sometimes we, like the grinding work of just doing stuff in 10s and 20s, I don't think we often see the qualitative aspect of it, that you're having an impact amongst more folks who just ain't gonna come to the meeting, but they are actually listening, engaging and learning over a course of time. And then folks, I think, when their time, capacity, and interest coincide, they will move. I think that's what we've seen, on all of these different issues, over the period. I think it's us getting beyond the pessimism of the present moment around how apparently ineffective and not our perception that we don't have a certain amount of power. I think that is a trapping of our own minds, actually, to a certain extent, and we got to break out of that.
Two thoughts. One is, several years ago, a commercial building in New Jersey was the first net zero commercial building in the country, or whatever. Only electric, not other forms of energy, but electric, right? Because they put solar panels on the roof. And when it was first laid out, it was not designed to be a net zero building. But what the owners of the company and the building did was they even built their own monitoring system. And they put it in like the lobby of the building. And so every employee who came and went saw that. And after a short period of time, once the building went solar, it was actually a net zero building because the employees looked at the monitor and related that to what they did during the day, and it then became a net zero building. I think that some of these things, like discussions about supporting the Green New Deal as it is or whatever, I view this as you gotta kick the chop out from under the wheel so the cart can start moving. Once the cart's moving, a lot of other things become possible. I take a lot of your points, I'm just saying that until the cart starts moving, nothing's gonna happen.
I think the car is moving, right? So the car is moving, but the question is like, can it fit everybody? There's a lot of other questions, right? I mean, the car, which we can think of as mass consciousness. I mean, Kelly's just been talking about it a lot. It's moving. People are ready. I mean, most young people are like, okay, well, I have a planet to grow up in, to grow old in. I mean, this is like an immediate question in front of, well, there aren't that many young people here, but like, in fact, this is, it's clear. So the car's moving. The question is what is the political organization to articulate that in a necessary way? I mean, is the car going to move fast enough to get away from the petrodollar? I mean, is the U.S. looking like it's going to accept to go down gracefully in its control over the Middle East? Are the petroleum companies going to let go gracefully? I mean, this is the basis of U.S. capacity to spend. The U.S. consumer of last resort is the fact that the U.S. is able to issue bonds that people need the dollar as the currency of exchange on world markets and so forth. The U.S. is not going to let go of that very easily, and that's very much what Trump represents. But really, a lot of the Democrats represent as well, although some are thinking about other options. That's not going to be let go easily, and it's also not going to be let go, furthermore, when there's no relationship between anti-war organizing and the environmental movement, and when anti-war organizing is actively demonized. Right? If you want to move against the wars in the Middle East, you need to actually understand that we are at war and that those wars need to stop. But in the current context, if you talk too much about the war in the Middle East, someone will think, okay, you are a supporter of the mullahs in Iran, or you are a supporter of, Bashar. You're like, no, I just don't want to send U.S. weapons over there. That's it. That's my position. It's not more than that. And there's a lot of flack fired at one's position if one takes that position, which is very much related to what you're talking about. Like, we can't get rid of the petrodollar without actually the withdrawal of U.S. forces from the region and the withdrawal of U.S. proxies from the region. I mean, I think that's very important. I agree in part with what you're saying about more democratic forms of energy. I mean, and it's something I've looked at a lot for Tunisia. There's a lot of proposals for using dispersed forms of solar energy and using kind of artisanal manufacturing technologies to gather them. And I think that's very important for countries in the global south when they're choosing developmental paths, but I also think that is the next field of battle, right? The next field of battle is who will benefit from a clean energy transition. And so you have Warren, you have China, and forces within China have different aspirations for their own society. Some of them are like, okay, China's going to use this opportunity to become the world leader in exporting clean tech based on the kind of mineral deposits that China has. And the US is like, okay, well, we're not letting China take our place. So there's going to be a war over that issue, which again brings us back to the question of militarization, right? So I just think, I don't think we can rely on technology to do our work for us in terms of shifting the social relations.
The fact that we even having this conversation is evidence that it's moving, right? And for me, what I've at least tried to make clear from the beginning, I applaud, make it practical. I applaud AOC for what she's trying to do. She wasn't even sitting in the seat before she started introducing that. That's a major political risk within that framework that she took, and I think that she needs to be supported in doing that. So I can offer support and at the same time push you, like, no, this piece ain't gonna work. I want you to keep talking about this, but I'm gonna keep struggling with you over around how this is articulated, where it's framed to go. That's, I think, the broader perspective of at least, I'm gonna speak for myself, of what I've been pushing from the beginning. So it's not like I ain't trying to, deconstruct you. Hey, I'm gonna speak to the understanding of history that we know certain paths are not going to lead to everybody being included. And if we don't speak to that, then it's actually a fault of ours, not hers. So, that's where it's at. I think it's moving. I think it's a step in the right direction. We just need to make sure that it drives a little bit further than the previous efforts at this deal, this before. Let's learn the lessons of the limitation of all those deals and figure out how do we go further.
In that context, and maybe this has been addressed, you've already addressed this before, but you've got plans from people like Elizabeth Warren, which are actually to the right of the Green New Deal, she's talking about green militarization. She's talking about a specifically export-driven plan, which ironically leads us into the problems of mid-century American capitalism, when we don't even have the global economic framework. You know, the capital was completely destroyed during World War II. The United States had this primary position that it simply doesn't have anymore. How do we deal with that? Should we be attacking it directly? Are there more subtle ways in which we can articulate how this sort of liberal vision is completely inadequate?
Yeah, I think that those policies need to be attacked head on, right? Demilitarization and ecological restoration have to go hand in hand. I mean, for so many reasons, both because of the raw requirements and also, of course, the imperialist system that the militarization both ensures and reproduces, right? So I don't think we can let that pass in the least. I think actually precisely it brings up the very contradictions that we're trying to address, right? It brings up that this social bloc she's trying to represent is arguing for a continued US imperialism based on industrial export, and that is exactly the world we oppose. So I think we need to address that directly. I mean, I think the fact that she is forced, that this is the specific way she's crafting her policy package, speaks to how the cart is moving, speaks to how issues need to be framed in terms of climate going forward on the liberal left spectrum, right? We're going to see a lot of reformulation of policies that incorporate the critique of the ecological effects of the current system while also saying, okay, we basically need to keep the social structures intact, which is why we see a lot of emphasis on basically a technological approach to climate change, or even a technological approach to eco-socialism, where people are like, okay, we're going to do asteroid mining for eco-socialism, right? So there's a lot of ways that the issues are being avoided, and I think it's important to be able to critique those while at the same time putting forward our own positive vision.
I wonder, since Operation Jackson has engaged both in building alternatives right here now and participating in electoral politics, I wonder what you think about finding a balance between doing something locally and at the same time trying to mobilize the movement or build a force that would push for more radical changes from political forces already in power.
Well, it's a question of what lessons you learned too. Mm-hmm. And I would say that we have been more implicated in electoral politics from being part of a strategy. But where electoral politics is at in our context locally right now is pretty reactionary, actually. I'm talking about on a municipal level. So I think we have to re-articulate how we want to be even involved on that level very fundamentally. Because clearly the way things are going on the municipal level now is not things that we support. So there's some lessons that I think we have to really look and interrogate and come to some consensus on. How did that division of kind of labor, what it was supposed to be. So for folks who don't know what I'm talking about, so there's a Jackson-Cush plan that we come out of. And theoretically, there was supposed to be kind of a threefold division of labor. Some folks who were focused on concentrating on building dual power through People's Assembly. Another group of folks that was supposed to be focused primarily on building an independent electoral politics, and then work around developing and advancing the solidarity economy. So Cooperation Jackson falls solidly within that third one. And unfortunately, the first one really right now, I would argue, it fundamentally doesn't exist. Like there really isn't an independent kind of articulation around building a People's Assembly in the here and now. And then the electoral politics is gone, in my personal view, fundamentally awry. So there's some things that I think we need to, as individuals, as organizations, I think really reflect on our own practice the last 10 years to figure out what could have been done better and going forward, what's the way forward. So, one thing that I personally am working on, we have to create more time and space to talk about some things going forward, in Cooperation Jackson. And I think I don't know if Brandon's another member of co-coordinator, I don't know if he would agree, because often the time we just don't have enough time in the daily grind to sit down and talk about a lot of things strategically. But we've come out of I think we're kind of at the tail end of a very intense period that I would call nothing short of like a civil war that was going on in Jackson. And I think we kind of, to a certain extent, took some right decisions to step out of certain parts of that and let them just do it, let them do what they're going to do. And we have to go deeper and perfect what we do. And our work was suffering from trying to be two different things when we barely had the capacity to do one. But I still think that we need to have a rearticulation of what protagonist governance looks like. And what I mean by that, so some folks have taken my comments to mean that some of the things I've said, because it's often incomplete statements or a little half quote from something here or there, for whatever my personal views have weight in the social movement right now, to say that my arguments are saying I'm totally against electoral politics. I'm like, actually, that's not the case. That's not what I'm arguing for. I'm arguing for that the left needs to be much more clear about what it does engage and when it does engage in anything, but electoral politics in particular. And that if our forces, at least on, say, like a municipal or state level, if we're not there to really push what I call a protagonistic form of governance. And what I mean by protagonist is you enter into that force to heighten the contradictions in the interest of the working class and the oppressed. Not to make compromises with capital, or not think that you're there to manage the contradictions of capitalism, which can't be managed, right? But if we don't enter into that space and make it practical, and what does that mean, practical? If you want to enter that space and really push your politics, you're only going to be there 4 years, at least in the current dynamic. And you should walk in there understanding, I'm going to push this hard with the expectation that I'm probably not going to be here 4 years, but that's the point. Right, that I'm gonna try to push the envelope and move it to such a degree that either I'm working my way out of office because the office won't be necessary, or, I've heightened the contradictions to a certain point. I've moved the movement to another need and I won't be here, or I get voted out because folks don't like it. But I think that, for me on the deeper, this experience that we've had the last 10 years, we did a number of things prematurely. And I think getting into electoral politics was one of them. So it's one of the things I think, Jackson and us have kind of been noted for. We did this amazing electoral victory. I'm like, y'all not living with the consequences of that victory in the same way that we are. Mm-hmm. And the consequences of that victory is there's been a whole bunch of black people that have been killed by folks under the authority of folks who I once called comrades. Mm-hmm. And I spent a lifetime literally fighting against police terror, as a basis of my political project. Now, I'm confronted with my comrades being in charge of the folks who are executing that. That's a profound head, in a certain sense. But what do we learn from that? And then how do we articulate it to folks to be like, I think we've done some good work. I think we could have done better, but there's certain aspects of the logic that I think that we thought our way out of, or at least that what was implied, but we actually didn't. And I think that there's ways in which, why I was pushing on the comrade earlier, like, look, we got to broaden our imagination. And I'm saying, I was articulating that, just to be clear, from the concrete experience that I think I have of saying there were certain assumptions that were embedded in some of the thinking around where this society is and by what rules and norms it operates on. But we didn't look about internally how we have accommodated ourselves to those limitations as organizations and as individuals. And I've seen time and time again, well, we need to compromise here because this is what's possible to do. Like, well, I didn't come here to do what was possible within the confines of the system. I thought we agreed that we were going to do everything possible to shatter this, to destroy this, to move beyond that, not accommodate ourselves to it time and time again. So I think there's some deeper learning on this that I think we have to look at in the hearing now. But the only thing, I'll end with this. We are not having enough serious engagement, in my view, around how do we actually build strong social movements. And that should be in the lead of whatever we're trying to do as the real transformative power, not trying to put electoral politics and politicians as the leading force in what happens. Like, that's the wrong end. And, as Max had brought up, like, are we having a conversation about politics or are we having a conversation about policy? And to a certain extent in this country, right now, any conversation about electoral politics is really a conversation about policy. I was joking with somebody last night, but I was dead serious. You know, they were asking me about did I watch the debate with Kamala Harris and somebody else? And I said, no, I didn't watch it. You know, I read some things. Like, well, why? You know, you're a political beast. Why didn't you watch it? I said, look, let me be honest with you. Let me be honest with you. All they're talking about is how to manage the empire. I don't want to be in the empire. So to a certain extent, they got no bearing on me other than I just need to watch, or say, if Kamala Harris wins, this is the shit I need to be prepared for that she's going to try to execute and enforce upon me. To that extent, I'm watching the monitor. But whether she's there or Bernie is there, whatever, the empire is the empire. But that ain't going to change. So it's like, what my focus is, I'm not, you know, that's the job requirement. You know, that's what when you sign up for that role, that's what you sign up for. So I'm like, I'm not really focusing on that other than, you know, are they gonna, you know, shoot me in the head or shoot me in the stomach? You know, which one are they aiming for? That's the real concrete difference between them. You know, like, are you gonna starve me or are you gonna put me in prison? You know, like which one of these two strategies are you going to employ?
I live in a suburb. Each one of the members of my family have an automobile. We don't have a good, serious public transportation. But even if we did, jumping that cultural hurdle to take a bus or a train to go shopping is bigger than people think. And so when we say we're going to reduce automobiles, which I'm 100% in favor of, and at this point almost by any means necessary, there's a political consequence for that for those who are advocating it. And you just have to be aware of this and learn how to fit that into one's, you know, plan that we put forward on how to get from here to a solidarity economy, if you want to use that expression. It's a euphemism for socialism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very important, and I think this is how we can read a lot of the literature and the plans that are coming out saying, okay, we can maintain the existing technology and just swap in new batteries. People are basically saying we don't want to do the hard work. In the first case, I'm engaging with people and saying, okay, things are going to have to change, and that's okay. And let's have a discussion about what that looks like in order to have a livable planet, right? Like, that's what politics is, and people are like, no, forget it, let's just have policy, right? That's the first case. But I think the other thing that's also important to keep in mind is why that's able to happen, right? And that's able to happen because where are the batteries for the cars going to come from? That's going to come from China, and that's going to come from Chile and the Southern Cone and the Congo. And why are the prices of those metals cheap? Is because all those countries have been destroyed by the US, so they can't raise the prices of the metals. So of course there's a whole imperialist system that makes it so that we can imagine, and that the planners can imagine, and the bad planners, the technocratic planners, can imagine saying, okay, we're just gonna swap in the batteries, right? So all of that needs to be brought into the conversation so we can approach people and say, okay, these issues are all connected. If you want an ecological planet and you want an anti-imperialist planet, we're gonna have to also talk about planning, and these are the ways, this is the nexus of why all those conversations are actually part of the same conversation. And it's part of being aware of that, and also being aware of the forces that are saying, no, let's cleave everything apart into its own silo, and we're only going to deal with it one way. And what that actually means is maintaining imperialism, and everything's going to be at the cost of the global south, just so that you can drive around the suburbs.
So y'all all ready to go do some more deeper organizing, right? That's what we all walking away with? All right, well, thank y'all for coming. All right. Hopefully it was good.